We are very good in time. So let's come to our next panelist in this first panel and session. This will be Momme Schwarz from Leipzig. Momme is a research associate and PhD candidate working with other scholars on a huge project of an Encyclopedia of Jewish Cultures at the Saxonian Academy in Leipzig. His main areas of research are the history and influence of the Jewish labor movement and Jewish diplomatic history. Currently, he is running a PhD project on transformations of European Jewish diplomacy in the 1930s, the case of the early World Jewish Congress. And his topic of today is transformations of European Jewish, his topic today is Jewish minority protection during the interwar period, the Comité, délégations, juives, and the Schwarzbard trial. I hope Momme is on the screen.
Yes, I can see myself. I hope everyone else can see me. Thank you very much, Olaf, for this very kind introduction. Thank you also, Roy and his team for setting up this conference. I'm still hearing an echo. I hope this can be resolved. Yeah, now it's good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roy and his team, for putting up this conference in this very difficult and also sad times, as I've learned recently about the passing of your director. Yeah, my condolences to all of you who knew and worked with him. I didn't know him, but I imagine the great loss his passing means to all of you. Before starting, I would like to briefly outline what I have prepared for today. I'm referring now briefly to the person in charge of my PowerPoint presentation. Is everything running okay? I will mention when the next slide should be shown. I hope we can get this cooperation to work. Okay, there it is. I see it. Thank you very much. So I have divided my talk in essentially 3 parts, and as Olaf mentioned, I will introduce a Jewish voice in the interwar period, which is the Comité de délégations juives. And in my first step, I will introduce the Comité and its effort to bring about the implementation of minority treaties at Paris, and to sketch out its ideological roots and one of the driving forces, which was Leo Motzkin. The second step is then to look at cooperation the Comité engaged in the interwar period. Especially, I'm trying to highlight the Congress of European Nationalities, in which it was engaged to promote the Jewish cause. And thirdly, I would like to reflect on the Schwarzbard trial and the involvement of the Comité, and ask if and how the trial lends itself as a showcase for the struggle of Jewish minority protection in the interwar period. I will remain time-wise in the limit of the 1920s and early 30s. If wished so, I can happily expand, of course, what has happened after, especially in 1933, and how Jewish minority diplomacy evolved from there on. On March 25th, 1919, representatives of Zionist and National Jewish Organization from Eastern Europe, Palestine, and the United States gathered in Paris to institute Jewish diplomatic representation at the peace conference that had begun just 2 months earlier. The goal of this Comité de délégations juives auprès la Conférence de la Paix, and here please forward 1 slide. Thank you. The goal of this comité was to persuade the great powers as well as the post-imperial nations of Eastern Europe, including Poland and Romania, but also Hungary and the Baltic states, to implement minority rights for their Jewish population. And on the screen, you can see some of the most prominent actors of the Comité, among them Julian Mack, Nachum Sokolov, and Leo Motzkin. As a result of the disintegration of the three great multi-ethnic empires, namely the Russian, the Habsburg, and the Ottoman, and the associated territorial changes, 35 million people were now considered minorities in various states. In Poland, for example, Germans, Jews, Ukrainians, and Belarusians made up almost a third of the population, inevitably challenging the state on many levels. One concern of the Paris conference was therefore to protect the minorities from discrimination and involuntary assimilation, as many of the new states were geared toward ethnic, cultural, and linguistic homogenization. The approximately 5.5 million Jews of Eastern Europe were particularly at risk. In many places, they were hardly acculturated, belonged mostly to the lower middle class or proletarian strata, spoke Yiddish, often still lived in traditional shtetls, and thought of themselves in religious or national Jewish terms. And here I would like to show slide number 2. I hope this is visible. This is a chart on which you can see the Jewish populations after World War I in the various countries, and the year also the minority treaties were signed. As you can see, in Poland, in Romania, Hungary, but also in Lithuania and Latvia, the number of Jews was significantly high and therefore clearly demanded a judicial agreement. Consequently, the Jews feared being degraded to second-class citizens because of their distinctiveness, or worse, being left unprotected against violent anti-Semitic uprisings. In effect, unlike the German or the Hungarian, the Jewish minority could not hope for advocacy or an intervention of a co-national state in the event of discrimination or attacks. To this end, the Comité in Paris urged the various Western powers specifically to impose legally binding minority protection treaties on the newly forming states. On May 10th, the committee submitted a detailed memorandum to the conference spelling out its demands. It provided for the Jewish population to be granted group rights, to be allowed local self-government, their own educational institutions, ability to levy taxes, and parliamentary representation. Thus, according to the justification, the Jews would not only be protected from exclusion, but as a national minority, they would be granted a necessary degree of self-government. Such demands were met with massive resistance from the concerned governments. Poland and Romania in particular, as you can see on the chart, states with a high proportion of minorities, protested sharply against any regulation imposed from the outside. They claimed complete sovereignty for their communities and considered themselves to be degraded to second-class states by the cession of powers to the League of Nations. Moreover, they expressed fear that the granting of far-reaching minority rights would encourage irredentist tendencies among minorities and thus undermine the desired process of integration and assimilation. For this reason, there was little willingness on the part of the United States, Great Britain, and France to enforce the Comité's demands, which were perceived as too far-reaching. Although the necessity was recognized to create contractual regulations, especially for the Jewish minority, there was a noticeable inclination to avoid a drawn-out conflict with Poland and Romania. Consequently, in the Polish Minority Treaty, which was finalized between the Allies and Poland in June 28, 1919, not much remained of the aforementioned Jewish demands. In particular, the deletion of the collective legal status for Jews clearly limited their room for maneuver in cases of conflict, since they were only able to take action against violations as individuals, but not as a collective. At the same time, the clauses on the protection of minorities were signed by 13 other states, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Latvia, and Lithuania. Notwithstanding their shortcomings, the adoption of the minority treaties sparked worldwide enthusiasm among Jews of virtually and political and ideological persuasions. They were hailed as the universal charter of Jewish rights, according to which any state violation of any linguistic or religious minority was no longer to be regarded as merely a domestic problem, but as a violation of requirements of the international community and of international law. The Comité also considered the acceptance of the treaties as a success of their diplomatic efforts. For the first time, the delegates of a Jewish organization managed to influence the political decision makers of the great powers as non-governmental actors. In addition, they convinced them that the approximately 5.5 million Jews were national and not merely a religious minority, and therefore should be granted extensive rights in order to preserve their national cultural characteristics. With this demand, the Comité stood in the tradition of the so-called Gegenwartsarbeit. This advocated the idea that it should be possible for Jews to develop a secular national culture free of all political and legal obstacles, even outside a future homeland in Palestine. It demanded that the Zionist movement should be equally determined to represent the political and cultural interests of the Jewish diaspora as it was in its distant goal of establishing their own state. This idea was prominently put forward by the Secretary General of the Comité, Leo Motzkin. Motzkin was born in 1867 near Kiev and had gone to Berlin to study under the specter of pogroms that had begun in the Ukraine in 1880. In Berlin, he first joined the Russian Jewish Scientific Society, which brought together secular and anti-clerical-minded Jews from the Russian Empire to ponder questions of national affiliation, as well as the future of Jewish people. In particular, the anti-Semitic pogroms in Ukraine, as well as the continued, oftentimes state-sanctioned, violent exclusion of Jews from the society of Eastern Europe, led Motzkin to give up his studies and devote himself entirely to the Jewish cause. Consequently, it was also Motzkin who, in consultation with leading colleagues of the Comité, such as Stephen S. Weiss, Julian Mack, and Nachum Sokolov, ensured that the Comité did not dissolve after the conclusion of the Paris conference. At least three reasons prompted them to continue their work. First, they were convinced that the massive rejection of the treaties by the Polish and the Romanian governments required some form of Jewish control. Secondly, they considered the minority treaties and the associated procedure for submitting petitions to be inadequate and thus in need of a revision. Thirdly, since the position of a representative body for Jews of Eastern Europe did not exist otherwise, the continued presence of the Comité seemed indispensable. So in essence, the activity of the Comité in the 1920s was determined by the consequences of the war itself. From the office organized in Paris, its few employees devoted themselves to documenting and intervening against attacks and repressions of Jewries in Eastern Europe. This included the publication on the anti-Jewish pogroms in the Ukraine in 1919 and 1920, in which Motzkin, together with the future director of the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, Elias Cherikover, compiled extensive material on the situation in Ukraine. In addition, in order to provide immediate assistance to the millions of Jewish stateless persons and pogrom victims, The Comité, together with 68 Jewish aid organizations, organized the founding of the Jewish World Relief Conference. By the end of its existence in 1925, this conference collected over 1.5 million US dollars in donation and distributed them in form of food, medicine, and clothing to the suffering Jews. The Comité's activities, however, revolved around the revision of the minority treaties, more specifically, the petition procedure. This had been established by the League of Nations between 1920 and 1923 to allow minorities to report violations on the treaties. While the petition procedure represented a profound innovation in international law, in reality it proved to be a bureaucratic monster. It was riddled with countless obstacles, resulting in complaints being rejected on technicalities or not further pursued because of overriding political interests. Recognizing that their singular efforts to alter the League of Nations procedures offered little chance of success, in 1925, the Comité accepted the invitation of the Baltic publicist Ewald Amede to join the European Congress of Nationalities. Its inaugural meeting, held in Geneva in the immediate vicinity of the League of Nations, was attended by 45 delegates from 12 countries, among them the Comité delegates Itzhak Grünbaum, a member of the Polish Sejm, the Lithuanian lawyer Jacob Robinson, the Latvian member of Parliament Mordechai Nurok, and the Czechoslovak lawyer Emil Margulis. The goal of the Congress was to offer the national minorities of East Central and Southeast Europe a stage to present their interests. As a non-governmental body, it also sought from the outset to give the minorities the status of a legal subject under international law. Glad to join forces with other minorities, Jewish groups under the leadership of Motzkin participated actively in its annual sessions. And here, please go on one slide where you can see a picture of a meeting of this European Congress of Nationalities, among them Leo Motzkin. Joining the Congress strengthened the self-image of the Comité within the Jewish camp, as it underscored its view, as well as that of the Zionists, that the Jews of the diaspora should be regarded as a national minority, a view contrasted by the French and British lobbyists of the Alliance Israélite Universelle and the Joint Foreign Committee, who resolutely rejected such an understanding. More importantly, though, the Congress offered to present Jewish concerns beyond their own limited circles, providing publicity and recognition for Jewish demands as part of a larger unresolved issue. Until the rise of National Socialism and its ideological adoption by the German minorities led to the Jewish withdrawal from the Congress in 1933, the Forum provided not only a noteworthy counterbalance to the raging climate of aggressive nationalism, it also symbolized the aspiration of the Comité and others to further democratize and advance the realm of diplomacy. While the European Congress of Nationality provided the Comité an avenue for cooperation and exchange, Jews still found themselves alone in many struggles. And one affair proving this reality was the trial of Jewish watchmaker Sholem Schwarzbard. On May 25th, 1926, Schwarzbard shot Ukrainian foreign correspondent Semyon Petliura in broad daylight in Paris. 7 years earlier, Petliura had been among the leading military figures of the Ukrainian People's Republic. After the end of World War I, militias under his control fought against Russian Bolsheviks, as well as against their adversaries, the White Guards. In the course of these armed conflicts, bloody pogroms against the Jewish population occurred, during which between 50 to 60,000 Jews were murdered. units under Petliura's command killed about half of these people. Schwarzbard, who lost 14 family members in these pogroms, was arrested after the shooting. He confessed to the crime, stating that he condemned it to, quote, avenge all the pogroms, the blood, and the hatred of the Jews. Immediately after it surfaced, the case stirred up international Jewish publicity. The Jewish press in Europe, America, and Palestine widely reported on the incident in Paris. Please advance one more slide. You can see a picture from the Detroit Jewish Chronicle covering the event in Paris. Simultaneously, comités formed from Melbourne to Buenos Aires to Tunisia in support of Schwarzbard. The Comité, led by its office in Paris, the Comité de délégations juives, led by its office in Paris, took the lead and established the Schwarzbard Defense Committee as early as June 1926. It coordinated the activities of various relief funds and located witnesses and documents proving the horror of the pogroms and Petliura's involvement. The focus of its efforts, however, was to draw public attention to the suffering endured by Ukrainian Jews and for their need of guarantees of international protection. In contrast to the Dreyfus affair 30 years earlier, in which the defense sought to keep the Jewish origins of the accused in the background, the Schwarzbard Defense Committee was determined to bring the Jewish dimension of the crime to the fore. More than that, Motzkin and company pushed to turn the murder into an indictment of the inaction by European governments and the League of Nations in the face of anti-Semitic violence. They referenced the numerous petitions made by Jewish organizations to the League of Nations in 1920 to take action against the killings in Ukraine and hold those responsible accountable. All demands were rejected by the LON on the grounds that the Minority Treaty did not apply in Ukraine and that they lacked effective means of intervention. Since the League of Nations remained dormant in the following years regarding petition against the numerous clauses in Hungary and against the expulsion of Galician Jewish war refugees threatened by Austria, many Jews viewed Schwarzbard deed as a legitimate act of self-defense. And please, move on to the next slide, where you can see Sholem Schwarzbard in Paris making his case in the court. And even if such attitudes were met with opposition, disappointment with Geneva united the entire Jewish camp. A few years earlier, Jewish advocates had euphorically and hopefully celebrated the establishment of the League of Nations. At last, according to them, Jews would no longer depend on the mercy of individual rulers or governments, but their well-being would be secured by the rule of law and supervised by a powerful institution. By the mid-20s, not much remained of this euphoria, as evidenced not only by the League of Nations inaction or lack of intervention, but also by the difficulty of reforming the petition process. Schwarzbard's acquittal in October 1927 brought, however, only ephemeral relief. The Defense Committee welcomed the court's decision to place Schwarzbard deed in a larger context and therefore appreciating his motives. At the same time, it was cognizant that this case would not solve any structural problems facing Jews of Eastern Europe. On the contrary, many critics of the verdicts and of the heroization of Schwarzbard, including Jewish ones, pointed to the long-term consequences of the verdict. They felt it would primarily amount to turning large numbers of Ukrainians against Jews, a fact evident in a notable right-wing jolt among the Ukrainian population in the 1920s. So to conclude, the founding of the Comité in 1919 and its involvement in the European Congress of Nationalities, but much more the Schwarzbard trial, illustrate the contradictory moment for Jewish minority organizations such as the Comité in the interwar period. It showed how easily Jewish advocates were able to transfer from Stadtlanut, which was the traditional mode of advocacy, to the modern form of collective representation and negotiation. Jewish organizations were able to generate publicity for their own cause, to mobilize large-scale solidarity networks and prominent supporters around the globe, and, as in the case of Schwarzbard, to find success in his acquittal. This became apparent in the further course of the interwar period, when the founding of the World Jewish Congress in 1936 created a solid financial and organizational foundation built upon the limited structures of the Comité. While some successes were achieved in the fight against anti-Semitic discrimination, so in Romania and Danzig, the dilemma remained. For lasting and profound changes in the protection of Jewish minorities and in the containment of anti-Semitic violence, Jews always had to rely on the support of benevolent governments. In their final analysis, this became increasingly apparent to the Jewish actors. The only way to help the non-state actor was to create its own sovereign nation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Momme, for this very interesting presentation. I hope you could listen to our applaudation. And yeah, I think it brings us also a bit this presentation, all what you told us about the committee and its fight on the one side for more Jewish minority rights in Europe, on the other hand also for other minorities, at least in a certain stage. It will bring us also already a bit closer to the third topic then presented by Shalak on the fights of the Romani people rights in Europe in this interwar period. At the end, you just made the conclusions that okay, it is one of the findings by the committee self, by them the self-realization, the only way to improve the rights of the Jewish people in Europe might be the own sovereign national state. That leads me to an own first question. How have been the relations between the committee and the Zionist movements in this time of interwar period? I mean, the Zionist movement in that time was already in a well-developed stage. There was no Jewish state, but it was the movement itself was proceeding, and at least they shared some similar cases and intentions. As for first priority, of course, the discrimination, anti-Semitism, and the lacking rights of Jewish populations in a different way in different countries in Europe. How have the relations been that time?
Thank you very much for that question. In effect, you can say that all members of the Comité were Zionists. Leo Motzkin, as I mentioned, is the most prominent, but also if you look at other prominent figures, all came out of, if not the Zionist camp itself, but also out of the Jewish national camp. One maybe striking distance that Motzkin and his compatriots struggled with was the question of Gegenwartsarbeit, and that I mentioned because Motzkin was maybe in contrast to more hardcore Zionists who saw the resolvement of the Jewish question merely in the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Motzkin and the Comité were convinced that Palestine wouldn't solve the Jewish problem for the diaspora entirely. And so this concept of Gegenwartsarbeit, which he took from Simon Dubnow, actually, who developed this concept of national cultural autonomy, demanding that Jews should be recognized as a national minority, but should be granted wide-ranging rights of, national cultural autonomy and self-governance to live as a Jewish nation, even though the actual territory was missing. So, yeah, there was a big overlapping to sum up, a big overlap between members of the Comité and Zionist. Also, you can see that later on in the World Jewish Congress, where people like Nachum Goldman were members of the Zionist World Zionist Organization, and similar, or at the same time, member of the World Jewish Congress. So there was an overlap. What's maybe striking is the difference to other Jewish organizations, like the more, the westernized Alliance Israélite Universelle and the British Conjoint Foreign Committee, which were, harsh anti-Zionists and could not agree with the demands of the Comité to understand the Jewish as a national people.
Yeah. Very interesting. I will open the discussion or the room for questions right now to Momme. It's the same thing like we experience in other online events. It needs time to inspire for more discussion, more questions. The second part you had was for me also quite very interesting, because the Schwarzbard trial, at a certain way, it remembered me a bit to the assassination of Talat Pasha by Soghomon Tehlirian in 1921 in Berlin, and the same rather surprising outcome of the trial itself. Maybe you could just a little bit elaborate more about the reactions among the Jewish, the wider Jewish population in Europe itself. Not all these initiatives who strongly supported Schwarzbard, including, of course, the Ukrainian Jewish people, but the general resonance among European Jewry in general.
Thanks again. That's a very interesting point. I'm still, okay, there it's gone, the echo. Because there was actually a pretty noticeable division among the Jewish camp about this trial, also how the trial was run in terms of the support of Schwarzbard and also of the outcome. Because on the one hand, you had a large fraction of people who were saying, okay, the Jews obviously cannot rely on national institutions. Protections of the League of Nations is not happening. Pogroms are taking place, and Jews are being left, unguarded. And these people really strongly supported the deed of Schwarzbard, saying, okay, if we're left alone, if we're left unguarded, then this is the only chance we have, essentially self-defense. And this even went pretty far. I mean, in the aftermath of the trial, and also almost during the trial, Schwarzbard was heroized, extensively. There were poems written by Itzhak Munger. There were plays written and staged. There were huge celebrations after the verdict. And that was one side of the reaction, while on the other hand, and this was more coming out of the American camp, I would say American Jews who were saying this is very short-sighted. The celebration of Schwarzbard is not helping the Jews. First of all, we the Jews, referring to international law and the rule of law, while it is understandable how he acted, especially against the background of his own family history, you could not just simply disregard law and celebrate for someone killing another human being. secondly, what was also pretty noticeable was that, and I think I briefly mentioned it, that they were afraid of the repercussions. That the Ukrainians were, retaliating against Jews for this killing, and especially Motzkin and also people in the Comité were divided upon how far they should go, because they were sitting in the European Congress of Nationalities, working closely with the Ukrainian minorities, and there was a lot of tension growing because of the trial, and so there was also this fraction trying to be more moderate towards Schwarzbard and not hail him, as a hero for killing Petliura. Maybe not as a footnote, this fear and worry about the retaliation of the Ukrainians actually happened in 1941. There was a pogrom in Lemberg, in which thousands of Jews were killed, and this was actually by Ukrainian national forces considered as, the revenge for the Schwarzbard trial. So, yeah.
Thank you also for this background information and additional knowledge giving us here. Unfortunately, I think our 40 minutes are already over, even having this longer extended panel. Thank you so much, Momme. Maybe you will be among us virtually for the rest. If not, or we hope to have you among us at one of the forthcoming conferences or workshop seminars in Berlin or Potsdam or maybe Leipzig, anywhere. All the best. Have a nice Sunday, and we continue with our third